Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci.
Hello, everyone. Would you mind taking a seat so that we can start our session number 14? You know the theme, to produce in a world of scarce resources. So we will organize the session in a traditional way. First, an introduction by Philippe CHALMIN, a professor of economics history at Paris Dauphine University and the coordinator of the Cyclope book. Philippe will outline the ins and outs of our debates. Christel BORIES, CEO of Eramet, Mrs. Makoma LEKALAKALA, the head of Earth Life Africa, an NGO, and she won't be with us in person, but she will be with us remotely. Then Jean-Philippe PUIG, the CEO of Avril, a agri-food group, Patrick BLETHON, executive president of the SOAR group, a major water company, and then Weiying ZHANG, a Chinese economist, a professor, National School of Development, the Chinese Friedrich von Hayek. Philippe, you are the Friedrich von Hayek from France. So, go ahead. Thanks a lot. The time of finite word is starting. We've used this famous quote written by Paul Valéry in the 1930s. Of course, it was not about natural resources, but at that time, the terra incognita on the planet had vanished into thin air. But more recently, we used against this quote in the 1970s the Stop to Growth motto by the Club of Rome. At the end of 20th century, there won't be any mining resources, that there will be a shortage of oil, and that famine will be rampant in many countries. Remember, during the crisis in 2008 and 2012, we took up again this quote from Valéry. Today, you have to consider the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and all these events have been conducive to energy shocks, agricultural markets, on the markets of mining and mines. And those shocks are systemic to a certain extent. Any element in a system has to do with the way it relates to others. This is what is being said in philosophy. So, following the climate crisis and changes to our consumption models, we are facing now an energy crisis, fast-tracking energy transition that's positive. It means that we need extra raw materials having to do with the electrification of our transport modes. Then you have to consider biofuels as well. And all these issues have been conducive to a food crisis. So this is July 2022. Energy prices have skyrocketed. Have a look at the gas prices, coal prices in Europe, the price of power, the price of electricity, and agricultural prices have also soared. The price of fertilizers has increased quite a lot. You have lithium, cobalt, nickel. Christel BORIES will be talking about nickel. So $100,000 a ton of nickel. It was unrealistic. The price has tumbled since then. But nickel is being used for batteries, and there are lots of tensions, and there are other metals to consider. Tin that is being used in the welding industry, in the semiconductor industry, palladium, pallinoid, palladium using in the exhaust pipes, in the catalytic exhaust pipes. There are also lots of tensions in agriculture. You have Ukraine, and in China there's a rise in consumption for crops, and we are talking about a global food crisis, especially in importing countries. In the 1970s, there was a motto, "Stop to growth" in France. A barrel against a bushel. This is what was said in the United States. We haven't yet reached this stage, but we're not too far. Once again, we are talking about themes that we've forgotten: food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, supply of raw materials, and sovereignty in the supply of raw materials. We try to avoid using fossil fuels. People are afraid of collieries, and people are crying foul when we talk about agricultural intensity. So we need to square the circle. Let's have a look at a few elements. Scarce resources, rare resources. Is it true? But when you look at the reserves on the planet, we have to wake up to the fact that scarcity is not really tangible. I will give you an example. The metals being used in the battery, maybe you used a battery-powered bike, so lithium 100,000 tons, and the reserves are estimated at 22 million tons. Cobalt 170,000 tons produced globally. Reserves are lower, but 7.6 million tons. And you have heard about rare earths, 15 metals or so that are being used in some applications. So the global production is about 280,000 tons, and we have 120 million tons worth of reserves. There's a bottleneck, but not on mining resources. There's a bottleneck with the metal capacities, still on iron capacities and reserves. And that's a problem when you want to produce lithium carbonate, when you want to produce rare earths. It will also depend on the different types of usage. What is strategic today won't be strategic in the future. I will provide you with an historic example. Tin was a key metal as part of a second industrial revolution at the end of the 19th century. With a tin, you could produce white iron, and with Mr. Appert, we discovered tin, but tin is less converted into white iron. That's not the case. Half of tin is being used in electronic welding, and tin has boasted very good performances amongst the other non-ferrous metals. So much for the reserves. So we need to produce, and we are discovering something interesting. Time for agro-industry, time for mining is long. It takes 10, 15 years in order to develop a mining project, a greenfield project, an agricultural industrial project, and there are some contingencies. The legal framework might change. There are lots of tensions. There are lots of protests. Serbia and the people from Serbia refused to develop the main capacity for lithium in the world. And Peru, Mongolia were also worried about copper production. Prices are unstable. These are commodities market, and prices are unstable. And nickel, the price was between $3,000 and $100,000 a ton. So it is very difficult to embark upon a project. project that will take 10 or 15 years to materialize, and there are lots of uncertainties on these markets. Of course, you have to consider the outlook. In the 1970s, we said that there are lots of resources at the bottom of the oceans, the polymetallic nodules or modules. So we talk about resources. So I focused on fossil fuels, on mining elements, but there are lots of developments in biotechnologies to adapt farming production to climate change. We have to be cautious. We want to green everything, and we will end up in the mine, carbon black. But in fact, time is a rare resource, is a scarce resource, Philippe. So 1 minute left. Okay, right. So allow me to talk about circular economy. Circular economy plays a vital role. It's a tangible trend. Lead mining production is 4.6 million tons. The production of refined lead is 12.9 million. Two-thirds of your lead is being produced by the circular economy. It is being reused. For copper, it is less significant. We can recycle 70% of our paper. In the future, we'll be able to recycle electric batteries. It will be more complex with other metals. This begs the question of price instability of raw materials and secondary materials in the agricultural field. Mr. Jean-Philippe PUIG will be talking about that. It's a matter of recovering biomass from forest household waste. By way of conclusion, by the end of the 21st century, the Stop to Growth movement would have told us you will lack everything. At the end of the 21st century, the resources will be scarce, but we would have made the most of this century to manage the transitions. I will quote Apollinaire, who died 1 century ago. He died from Spanish flu. Be careful with COVID. So the twilight will not conquer the dawn, and let us be surprised in the evening, but let us enjoy dawns and the morning. So thank you for talking about Apollinaire, Valérie, lithium, and cans and tins. So Christel BORIES, you are the CEO of Eramet. So what about rare resources and scarce resources? How can they be tapped and managed? I think that resources will be increasingly scarce because they are very difficult to tap. If you have a look at the figures that you've mentioned, there are some reserves, there are resources rather. The reserves can be exploited economically, but there are some resources that can't be economically tapped, and I will be revisiting the question of rates and prices. To produce in a world of scarce resources, we have to think about the production of raw materials and commodities, and the mining industry has a significant role to shoulder. At Eramet, we have a purpose enshrined in our bylaws to become a reference of responsible transformation of the earth, natural resources, in order to live together, to develop a sense of togetherness. So, of course, responsible transformation should be in sync with the sense of togetherness. Why? With green transition, there should be energy transition, and energy transition that we would like to see. It will be using a lot of metals. We are talking about electric cars. You have a battery representing 40% of the value of the car. So if you want to electrify the economy, you will use a lot of copper. If you want to build a windmill, you will use copper, lots of rare and scarce metals. And if you consider the loading points, the recharging points for cars, you need a lot of metals. So as part of the energy transition, we will need a lot of metals. In terms of energy transition and the use of metals, demand for nickel will increase twofold, demand for cobalt will increase 3 or 4-fold, and demand for lithium will increase 6-fold. These are significant figures. These are huge figures. And for copper, this is a metal that is produced in huge quantities, and the quantity of copper being produced will increase twofold. Metals could be recycled, unlike oil. Oil is burnt and it vanishes into thin air. Metals can be used time and time again, but we need to engineer the recycling technologies on in our regions. We need to keep the secondary materials will be exported abroad, and especially in China, for refinement purposes. So the surface mining areas, should be kept on our soil, but you need to set off the pump. Of course, you have to consider the battery life, 12 years. A building has a lifespan of 10 years. So the economy will be increasingly electric, but we'll be using primary resources for batteries in 2030. Only 15% of the metals required for the batteries will come from recycling. In Europe, we have some capacity for recycling, so we would need lots of primary materials. How do we tap them? How do we exploit them in a responsible way? There are different modus operandi to do so. And in France, for us, a colliery, a mine is dirty, destroying the environment. It is reminiscent of the novel of Émile Zola, Germinal. But today we can produce responsible mining areas. We have big data that can help us. The geologists were the first data scientists. We have lots of data. We can crunch the data. You can use the wealth of the soil without using too much water, without using too much energy. So biodiversity is key. In Gabon, we opened a field and we used infrared cameras in order to see where the animals were, and we decided to protect 15% of the field in order not to affect and to undermine the animals, and these animals are protected. So we pay attention to water consumption. We are developing water that can be recycled because we don't want to pump into the aquifer. So you have some methods. There are some methods. These methods are developed by Eramet. And there's another key dimension, the societal dimension. We have a duty to operate in host countries. We will go to a country, we will extract natural resources in this country, and we have to make sure that populations can make the most of that situation. There are some people who are working in mines, they are well paid, they can get access to care, they can get access to training, but all the surrounding populations, should benefit from that. So we have developed some alternative economies, growing quinoa. We are building cobblestone plants, and economics shouldn't be linked to the mining industry. So it's a sense of togetherness. This is important. We want to make sure that we extract and we exploit natural resources in an accountable way, in a responsible way. To conclude, allow me to insist on the issue of costs. We've been talking about inflation for quite a long time. So, of course, all this costs quite a lot, especially if you care for the populations, if you are not frugal. So there's a kind of structural inflation that is embedded in our operating procedures. The citizens, will have to accept that, and the regulator will have a role to play. There shouldn't be environmental and societal dumping with some materials moving into Europe produced in bad conditions at a time when it is possible to produce in very good conditions. And we need to innovate in order to continue to develop those methods. So extracting raw materials and commodities in a responsible and accountable way, that's possible, that's indispensable, but the price will be higher, and we need to be aware of all that all together. Thank you, Christel. Thank you for your sanguine observations. We will go to South Africa. We will listen to Makoma LEKALAKALA. She is the head of Earth Life Africa, an NGO. We can see her on the screen. The floor is yours.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation. I've just listened to the two previous speakers, and at some stage my hair was shaking. We know that the climate crisis, the climate disruption is upon us. And in different countries, in different contexts, people are feeling the negative impacts of climate change differently. In South Africa, in the previous months, we just experienced flooding. This is coming up again, and in the northwest region of South Africa, this is where we have droughts. And further north in Limpopo and in the east, this is where Mozambique and Zimbabwe, where people have had devastating impacts, like experienced devastating impacts of climate change. And so that tells us that business as usual, it's not the way to go. And climate change is actually driving us to do things differently. If we don't do things differently, if we don't do our operations differently, we are on our way to extinction. Already we have seen that there's fewer resources due to our patterns of consumption. We have realized that resources are getting lesser and fewer over time. And in that, our environment and biodiversity is destroyed along the way, resulting in gross human rights violations. I feel that with the lesser resources that we have, and on the other hand, with the notion that we have to continue mining, we have to continue producing, it's somehow imbalanced, because I believe that producing should be in cooperation with nature. That would mean also respecting people's cultures and traditions. And we've had a different situation whereby mining, I think one of the speakers had said that, that there's been resistance by communities to mine in their own areas. Yes, they are respecting their cultures, traditions, and because most of them, their lives, their traditions are connected to nature, so it becomes very difficult for people to allow you to uproot them, to mine in their own ancestral lands where they've got their own heritage sites, where they've got their own sacred sites. So if you really go ahead and do mining or do whatever sort of infrastructure in that infrastructure construction in that particular area, you'd be uprooting people's dignity. And that is one of the issues that when people are saying, please don't touch here, don't touch, because that is what leads to overconsumption, and that's what leads to the disruption of the biodiversity. I'll make an example. I work in an area of Limpopo, that is the northern province of South Africa, in the Vembe region. This region, in the Vembe region, it's one of the richest biodiversity areas in the country, unique in its form. And then we get companies, or a special economic zone has been set there. And this special economic zone is going to be an energy metallurgical special economic zone that would include mining minerals, and also having a coal-fired power station and a coal-fired power plant. And ask yourself, if you really want to mine, in this area, there's more than 100,000 baobab trees, which are extinct and are protected trees in South Africa. There's almost also more than 100,000 of the mopane trees, which give a very nutritious food for the people around the area. There's also marula trees. Those are like the 3 trees that I can point out that they are in that particular 8,000 hectares. And if these trees are uprooted, there's no any other place in South Africa where they can be replanted or relocated. That means that those trees are going to die. But however, it's not only about the trees, it's also about the traditions of people. It's also about the sacred sites of the people that live or have lived there originally. They've got sacred sites there. They've got graves of their ancestors. There's an ecosystem balance there. Besides, there's a lot of trees. Obviously, there's a lot of animals that feed on there. There's a lot of ants, there's a lot of birds. There's streams of water in that particular area. And if that is destroyed, that means the disruption of the ecosystem around that area, the uprooting of people's dignity. And that is a concern. So when we grow, or we think of economic growth, or we think of growth, or we think of producing, let's also put those issues at the back of our minds, that our production does not have to destroy or disrupt. I agree with the previous speaker when she indicated that we need to rethink how we do things. Yes, on that point, I agree with you that reusing, repurposing, recycling, and reducing, but also refusing anything or any commodity that would contribute or would not be recyclable, would not be reusable, would not be repurposed, but also refuse any item or article that has been produced also by destroying nature and also by violating people's rights. I think for me, when we talk about producing in a world of scarce resources, we also need to say, how do we do this? Do we just want to say we want to produce for the sake of this is what we want to do? It doesn't matter whether we've it doesn't matter whether we have violated people's rights. Doesn't matter whether we have destroyed people's cultures and traditions. One thing is that I believe that if we are saying we are going to produce in this world of scarce resources,
sorry
that has got
to interrupt
be in
you,
solidarity
Mrs. Lekalala.
with all living beings,
Unfortunately,
and informed by the respect of social and environmental consideration. Because the more we produce, the more we go down and say the more we produce without considering social and environmental leading of the climate disruption, and also leading ourselves, the whole planet, to extinction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Merci à vous. Thank you very much.
So there's this very strong point that you made: recycle, reuse, but also refuse. And there's a clear and strong message there that really enriches our debate. So let me turn to Mr. Puig, who is the head of the Avril group, who's going to talk about the scarcity of resources that he observes. Hello. The question that's asked in this roundtable discussion is how to produce in a world of scarce resources. Europe is really dependent on energy level and protein levels. The Ukrainian conflict has awoken these dependencies by bringing prices up. And with climate transition, we need to make political choices that are drastic and courageous. Concerning the dependency of France and Europe, Philippe CHALMIN explained this clearly with the figures, but just a few examples for diesel. It corresponds to half of the fuel consumption in Europe, but diesel is 75% of consumption in France. Europe imports 20% of its diesel consumption. Of this 20%, 40% of that comes from Russia. So that sets the stage for diesel. The second point that I would like to stress is protein. Protein that's necessary to everyone, plant protein that's used for animal nutrition. It's the same observation. Even if France is better supplied than its neighbors, we import just under half of our needs, while Europe imports 2/3 of its needs. So we're aware of these dependencies in a painful way now with the Ukrainian conflict, because as of February 24th, we've been seeing a drastic increase in the price of energy, obviously, but all the farming materials, the price was already high at the end of 2021 because there had been very high demand linked to consumption for agricultural materials. Climate change meant that we had less material worldwide, but the crisis acted as a catalyst. There was a massive increase in prices with 4 simultaneous shocks off the supply. Of course, there was less supply. 30% of the wheat farms are in around the Black Sea. 60% of sunflower export comes from the same zone, so a decrease in supply, a price shock. The prices have gone up, and that's been amplified by financialization of all of the agricultural goods. So we've seen a drastic increase in prices and energy prices. We've had a supply chain problem. All of the products that are coming from the Black Sea are no longer being shipped. There's 20 million tons blocked in Ukraine currently. It's difficult to see how we can get it out now. And then there's also a demand side issue. Even if in agri-food it's quite standard, it doesn't shift overnight. Fear of lacking, so people are making precautionary purchases, and we find shelves that are empty, but that's temporary. We're aware, painfully, that we have dependencies, that there are imbalances, and Philippe mentioned this earlier. The word that comes back after the COVID crisis the most is sovereignty. Everyone wants to work on sovereignty, but we think in order to remedy these imbalances, we don't have the choice. We need to do things at the same time. If I look at energy, we have to develop renewable energies as quickly as possible, as much as possible, and we need nuclear power for farming. We have to develop farming that's respectful of the environment, but it must also be more productive. This is and. In France and Europe, we have a more privileged position. We heard our colleague from Africa. Economic instability comes from the southern countries and the developing countries, those that have neither energy nor raw materials and that have to buy at very high prices today are going to have a lot of problems, and this is going to create political instability globally. What I was saying earlier is that we need to make political choices that are difficult given the current tension. Historically, if we remember previous transitions, they were driven by technological progress, by steam, electricity, digital. And these transitions impose themselves, be they contributed to social progress. Climate transition is completely different. Climate transition must be imposed upon us by politicians. It's a difficult choice. It's a choice that's going to have impacts on the way we live. These difficult decisions have to be made over time in a continuous manner, and it's not what we've seen in the past, which was the first quality of our politicians. So there are real changes that we have to make. The April group realized a few years ago that we were lacking protein. In 1973, there was a blockage of the export of protein from the US, and Europe lacked protein. At the time, Europe was importing 90% of its protein needs from America. The French agricultural world said that's not possible. We need to structure ourselves better, and the group was created to develop oils and proteins in France, in Europe, of course, and with a model that's unique in the world, because the model does not pay out dividends. All the money that's made in the Avril group is put back into the development of protein in France. As a conclusion, we developed canola, rapeseed. We're at 1.5 million hectares presently in France. This is non-GMO protein that's used to feed animals, but it's also green energy, because the co-product of rapeseed is energy, so it reduces the energy balance for France. Each time you use biodiesel, you reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 60%. So we must accelerate this movement. We've worked well in the last few years, but it's not enough. We need to go more quickly. We need to go further. The French farming world has decided to develop sunflower seed. We're going from 700,000 acres to 900,000 in the coming years. We're developing new vegetables and plants. In Europe, we're eating more vegetables, so we're starting up a plant in Dieppe, which will be the first in the world to produce protein from rapeseed. To conclude, this is not enough. We need to work on innovation also. Without innovation, we won't go quickly enough, we won't go far enough. We need to improve the seed, phytosanitary products. We need to go the whole way down the chain in terms of innovation. So at Avril, we are here to serve the earth. That is our obligation. It's a commitment on our behalf, and it allows us to act against the three transitions: food, agricultural, and energy, to act to facilitate them. Thank you. So I'm now going to turn to Patrick BLETHON, who is the executive president of SOR in the field of water. It's already a scarce resource in many parts of the world. The advantage of water is that we need it in all of our production. We didn't talk a lot about it in the last COP meetings. That wasn't at the center of the debate. I hope it will be at COP 27 and 28. But I'd mostly like to come back to some figures. It's important to have some figures in mind. Water is used 70% for agriculture, 20% for industry, and 10% for domestic usage. Often we focus on the 10% of domestic usage and forgetting the big axis that we have to develop for the future. 50% for farming in France. There are figures that we're not always aware of when we talk about water scarcity. 7,000 liters of water to produce a pair of jeans, 1,500 for a laptop computer, and we were talking about food earlier. To produce a kilo of wheat, we're at 1,500 liters of water to produce wheat worldwide. We talk about the current context with Ukraine. There are different topics there. There's what's going on in Ukraine, the reserves that aren't reaching destination. There's an inflationist topic and speculative issue before Ukraine on raw materials, and this has to be recognized. But with respect to water scarcity is becoming a reality, and it's important for us to be aware of this. I'm not going to be too much of an activist on this topic, but if you look at the map of France today, there's a 10-year evolution that's quite worrisome. 35 French departments at the end of May were under hydric stress, and this is a reality. 1.5 billion people will suffer from problems of access to water in 2030. The statistics are here, show that we need to change our behavior. So 3 ways of changing behavior, one for the world of farming, and this is addresses a cultural change in the world of farming, and also industry in agriculture. So we're tending to create mega cities worldwide. We need to feed these populations in the cities, and there's an important role to play in using digital innovation to help the farming world to use water properly in the necessary quantities and not without any control. Today we know that sometimes the farmers are using the water table and then having a negative impact on local water quality. The next topic is industry. Today, industrial actors are the first ones to move into the water economy and to invest in order to be able to manage the water, and it's very important to work with them. There's an important activity in the world. Thirdly, we need to give access to all countries that don't necessarily have access to water, and there are 2 main topics. There's access, and we saw recently in Asia, there's another topic, the rise of water levels, climate change. So how can we protect Singapore, for example, in the next 20 years with rising water levels? So there's a major change in trends on these topics. Today we're at the Rencontres, Économiques. All of the players are here, and I'm convinced that climate transition and the work done on hydric stress will require the involvement of companies and financing with the emission of the issuing of green bonds with factual KPIs where we commit to water savings. And we need to continue to associate finance today to these scarce resources where we need to commit ourselves. We cannot do this without a real environmental strategy, without environmental results. Thank you. Our last speaker, before we ask Philippe to conclude. So we're going to China, and we'll listen to Mr. Zhang Weiying, who's an economist and a professor.
Being with us, it's quite late in Beijing, so thank you again. The floor is yours for 7 minutes sharp, please.
Okay, thank you. I would like to make following points. My first point is that scarcity of resources, this is a basic assumption, but it's only half truth. It's true in statics and in short term, but not true in dynamic in long run. History shows that resources are endogenous, changeable, not exogenous, fixed. Particularly, history shows that resources with economic value has been increased rather than decreased, both in quantity and in kind, since the Industry Revolution. For example, 150 years ago, oil was not resources. Bauxite was not resources. Many natural things were not resources. But today, they are very valuable resources. Since oil become valuable resources, there has been long warned by some people that oil reserve would be soon exhausted. However, fact is that the world crude oil reserve has increased even more recently. Even resources are fixed, productivity of each resources is not. Let me give you an example of China. In the late 1970s, there was a hot debate in China whether Chinese people should change their food structure from traditional grain-dominated food to more balanced between grain and meat, like West people. The opponents argue that given China has a very limited arable land but large population, Chinese people were unable to afford to eat meat. This argument sounds solid. However, the fact is that per capita pork consumption in China has increased by 200% from 1978 to 2018 without causing any shortage of grain. My second point is that what are resources, how scarce they are, how valuable they are, how much they can produce from each unit of resources, whether a given resources can be substituted for by another, all depends on what kind of knowledges, technologies we have. Innovation is the best way to reduce the scarcity of resources. For example, in 1850, the dominant fuels were wood, but in 1900, it was oil. 1950, that was coal. 1950, it was oil and gas. Future will be, we have diversified fuels. All this happened just because we have a new technology. I particularly like to point one example, like in the 1920s, the fast growing pine in South America were not usable for making paper. But the improvement in sulfate pulping technology during the 1920s made pine usable for pulp making. By middle of 1950, the pine will account for half of the United States' wood pulping capacity. So, in general, I would like to say the more advanced technology created more resources, make resources less scarce. My third point is that innovation is a function of entrepreneur. I do not downplay the role of scientists and inventor, but I emphasize entrepreneurs because entrepreneurs are more important in innovation for two reasons. First, only through commercialization do knowledge and technology benefit ordinary people and the economy. Second is entrepreneurs are better motivated to find new resources and substitute abundant resources for scarce resources by innovation. Insofar as resources concerned, business people, I think, should be thanked, not blamed. Thanks to innovating entrepreneurs, we human beings now have much more resources than before. That, I think, is very essential to create an entrepreneur-friendly institutional and policy ecosystem. We must let business people do their business as free as possible. But very unfortunately, I find today there are too many anti-business policy, anti-business law, which really discourage entrepreneurs to do more innovation. We also have anti-business culture worldwide. This is, I think, very, very damaging. my first point is that trade has been one of the most important mechanisms for easing resources constraints. It makes all resources more productive and provides more opportunities to explore new resources. However, trade is embedded in politics, geopolitics. Russian invasion of Ukraine shows that real challenge for our human being, particularly security, is international political conflicts derived from ignorance and ideology, not conflicts of economic interest. So it's very important to establish an international rule of law. It's not easy.
Thank you, Mr. Zhang.
Very hard.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Zhang. We're unfortunately running out of time.
Very famous French economist, a politician of the 19th century, is Claude Frederic Bastiat, who said that where goods do not cross frontier,
Sorry, but the communication is really bad. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you for on scarcity. Merci, merci à tous. L'heure approche de clôture.
It's time to close our session, Philippe. We're counting on you to be succinct and give us just the essentials. Listening to a Chinese economist making reference to Bastiat, that George Bush Jr. was the only one who was listened to by George Bush. They didn't want candles to compete with the sun. It was interesting. I didn't completely understand, but I was thinking of this quote saying we shouldn't look at yesterday with today's eyes, and we can't imagine the future with today's technologies. Your challenge for the three of you is undeniably that of technology, maybe Mr. BLETHON less than others, because we'll always need water, even if I hope, in particular with biotechnologies, that we will be able to limit hydric demand for agriculture. But for the rest, you're living in worlds, and this is very important. Of course, the resources are scarce, but we don't know what the real strategic products will be in future. In future, will you biosource materials and compete with a certain number of metals? Will the batteries still use lithium in future? Will there be a next generation of batteries? This is the uncertainty that we're dealing with. You have scarce resources, but we're in a world of uncertainty. And as Jean-Philippe said, we're marked by instability and so speculation. Don't forget speculation. Speculare in Latin is anticipating, and that's the role of economists. Thank you.